In the year 1998, there was a small, isolated town called Cedar Hollow, deep in the remote countryside. Once filled with the laughter of children, bustling markets, and the warm glow of evening lights in every home, the town was now nothing more than a forgotten relic. Houses stood abandoned, the streets overgrown with weeds, and whispers of an ancient curse lingered in the air. The town's few remaining residents had either left or disappeared over the years, claiming to hear voices in the wind or seeing shadowy figures in the corners of their eyes. They told stories of how Cedar Hollow was built on cursed land, a place where the dead were said to walk among the living. Some said it was a place where the spirits of those who had died unjustly sought revenge. Our protagonist, Michael, a man in his early 30s, receives a letter one autumn afternoon. The letter was simple, written in careful, almost ancient handwriting. "You have been chosen to witness the truth. Come to Cedar Hollow." There was no signature, no return address. Michael, a journalist with a passion for uncovering dark secrets, couldn't resist the pull of the mystery. Cedar Hollow had long been on his radar, an abandoned town with a past no one dared to speak about, a place swallowed by rumors of disappearances and strange happenings. Michael decided to drive there alone. He packed his bag with essentials, a flashlight, camera, notebook, and a tape recorder. Little did he know, this would be the last time he'd step foot into the life he once knew. The drive to Cedar Hollow was long and winding. The deeper he went into the forested roads, the less his phone had any signal. The trees grew thicker, their branches like skeletal hands reaching out to block the sky. As the sun began to set, casting an orange hue across the landscape, Michael finally arrived at the town's entrance. A decaying sign swayed in the breeze, the name Cedar Hollow barely legible under layers of grime and rot. The moment Michael stepped out of his car, he felt it. The air was thick with tension, and the silence was deafening. No birds sang, no crickets chirped. It was as if the town itself had been abandoned by nature, left to rot in stillness. He walked through the narrow streets, his footsteps echoing off the empty houses. Each home was like a tombstone, a reminder of a family that once lived there, now long gone. The windows were dark, shattered, or boarded up. But something was wrong. He couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. As nightfall approached, Michael decided to settle in the only place that seemed relatively intact, the old inn at the center of town. Its sign, hanging by a single rusted chain, read the Hollow Inn. Inside the inn, the air was damp, and the wooden floors creaked under his weight. Dust hung thick in the air, disturbed only by Michael's presence. He found a room on the second floor, far from the entrance, hoping for some quiet to review his notes. The room had a bed, a broken mirror, and a chair facing a window that looked out onto the main street. As he set up his camera by the window to capture footage of the eerie town, something caught his eye, a flicker of movement outside. A shadow darted between two houses, too quick to fully see. Michael froze, his heart racing. He waited, staring out the window for what felt like hours, but nothing else happened. When he finally lay down to rest, the whispers began. At first, it was faint, almost like the wind playing tricks on his ears. But the longer he lay there, the clearer the whispers became. It was as if a conversation was happening just beyond the walls of his room. Low, hushed voices speaking in a language he couldn't understand. Michael sat up, every muscle tense, straining to hear where the voices were coming from. He turned on his tape recorder, hoping to capture the sound. The whispers grew louder. It was no longer just one voice, but several, overlapping, echoing through the walls. And then, they stopped. For a brief moment, there was nothing but silence. Then, a knock came from the door. 3 slow, deliberate knocks. Michael's heart pounded in his chest as he stared at the door. He hadn't locked it. His mind raced. Was it the wind, or had something followed him into the inn? His hand hovered over the door handle, but he couldn't bring himself to open it. The knock came again. This time, it was louder. With shaking hands, he grabbed the camera and slowly opened the door, but there was no one. Only the dark, empty hallway greeted him. But there, just outside his door, was a piece of paper folded carefully. He picked it up, his hands trembling, and unfolded it. "Do not leave." The next morning, the fog had rolled into Cedar Hollow like a thick, suffocating blanket. Michael couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him as he ventured outside. The air was cold and damp, carrying with it an unnatural stillness. He felt disoriented, unsure of where the streets began and ended. As he wandered, trying to find any sign of life, he heard footsteps behind him. Slow, deliberate footsteps that crunched the gravel underfoot. He turned quickly, but again, there was nothing. Michael's nerves were fraying. Every corner he turned, every empty street he passed, he felt as though someone, or something, was watching him from the shadows. The fog was playing tricks on his eyes, making figures appear and disappear like ghosts. But they weren't just illusions. At the far end of one street, Michael saw it clearly this time, a figure standing motionless, just at the edge of his vision. It was tall, unnaturally thin, its form barely visible through the mist. He took a step closer, and the figure vanished into the fog. A chill ran down his spine. He began to question his sanity. Had the isolation, the whispers, and the strange happenings all been in his head? Was the curse of Cedar Hollow real? On the third night, everything changed. The whispers had returned, louder than before, filling the room with their eerie, unintelligible chatter. But this time, the whispers weren't just in the walls. They were inside his mind, circling his thoughts like vultures. As the hours dragged on, Michael found himself drawn to the window. There, standing directly beneath the street lamp, was a figure. Unlike the ones he had seen before, this one didn't disappear. It stood there, staring up at him with eyes that glowed faintly in the darkness. Michael grabbed his camera and rushed downstairs, his every instinct telling him to leave the town, but something had a hold on him. He felt compelled to confront the figure. When he reached the street, it was gone. But in its place, something else awaited him, scratches on the ground, leading toward the woods, as if something had been dragged away. The scratches in the dirt unnerved Michael, but curiosity, or something darker, pushed him forward. The trail led away from the town and into the dense, fog-filled forest that surrounded Cedar Hollow. The trees loomed like giants, their branches twisted and gnarled, blotting out what little moonlight seeped through the thick clouds above. As Michael entered the forest, the temperature seemed to drop. His breath came out in frosty puffs, and every step he took echoed unnaturally in the stillness. He glanced around, flashlight in hand, but the beam barely penetrated the thick fog. The trees appeared to close in on him, forming a labyrinth of shadows. Suddenly, he heard it, a soft rustling in the distance. At first, he thought it might be the wind, but then it grew louder, more purposeful, like footsteps crunching through the underbrush. He stopped, heart racing, listening intently. The sound moved closer. Michael spun around, scanning the darkness, but there was nothing. His breath quickened, panic setting in. Then, out of the corner of his eye, he saw a figure, just a flicker of movement, darting between the trees. He froze. It was the same figure he had seen in the fog, tall and unnaturally thin, moving silently through the forest like a ghost. Michael's legs felt heavy, rooted to the spot as the figure approached. But before it reached him, it vanished again into the mist, leaving behind only the echo of its presence. Michael's instincts screamed at him to run, to leave the cursed town behind and never look back. But something was keeping him there, a force stronger than fear, a compulsion to uncover the truth. The trail of scratches led deeper into the forest, to a clearing surrounded by ancient, towering oaks. In the center of the clearing stood a dilapidated cabin, its roof sagging and windows shattered. The sight of it made Michael's skin crawl. He had read about this cabin in old reports. It was said to be where the original settlers of Cedar Hollow performed strange rituals, where they had tried to communicate with the dead. He approached cautiously, the floorboards creaking as he stepped onto the porch. The door was slightly ajar, swaying in the breeze. Michael pushed it open and stepped inside, his flashlight illuminating the decaying interior. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of rot. The walls were covered in strange symbols, scratched into the wood, their meaning lost to time. In the corner of the room, a large, circular mirror stood against the wall, its surface cracked and covered in grime. Michael moved closer, drawn to the mirror for reasons he couldn't explain. As he wiped away the dust, his reflection came into view, but something was wrong. His reflection didn't mimic his movements. Instead, it stood still, staring back at him with hollow, sunken eyes. Michael's breath caught in his throat. The figure in the mirror smiled, a twisted, unnatural smile, and then, without warning, its hand reached out from the glass. Michael stumbled back in shock, but the hand never fully emerged. It hovered just inside the mirror, its fingers long and skeletal, beckoning him closer. The whispers returned, louder now, filling the room. They came from the mirror, from the walls, from his own mind. The voice in his head was clearer this time, a low, raspy whisper. "You can't leave, not until you know, not until you see." Panic surged through Michael, but his feet moved of their own accord, pulling him toward the mirror. The figure inside was no longer a reflection. It was something else, something ancient, trapped within the glass. As he stared into its eyes, he saw flashes of the town's history, the settlers who first built Cedar Hollow, their rituals to communicate with the beyond, and the terrible mistake they had made. They had opened a door to another realm, a place where the dead and the living were not meant to mix. And in doing so, they had cursed the land forever. Michael saw it all in rapid succession, images of people vanishing, being pulled into the dark by unseen hands, their souls trapped in Cedar Hollow, unable to move on. He saw the faces of those who had disappeared over the years, their tortured expressions etched into the landscape, forever bound to the town. The figure in the mirror whispered again, its voice soft but filled with malice. "You are one of us now. You will never leave." Michael tore his gaze away from the mirror, his heart pounding in his chest. The room felt smaller, the walls closing in on him as the whispers grew louder. He stumbled out of the cabin, his mind racing, trying to make sense of what he had seen. But the forest was no longer silent. The footsteps he had heard before were everywhere now, surrounding him. Shadows moved between the trees, figures watching him from the darkness. They were coming for him. Without thinking, Michael ran. The fog seemed to thicken, suffocating him as he sprinted through the forest, his flashlight flickering with each frantic step. He could hear them behind him, the figures from the mirror, from the fog, closing in, their whispers turning into a chorus of voices, each one more desperate, more terrifying than the last. "Come back, join us." His lungs burned, his legs screamed in protest, but he couldn't stop. The forest was alive with movement now, the trees warping and twisting as if they were trying to trap him. The ground beneath his feet shifted, pulling him deeper into the cursed land. He could see the town in the distance, the faint outline of the old and where he had stayed. But between him and the safety of the buildings was a growing sea of shadowy figures. They were waiting for him, watching as he drew closer, their eyes glowing faintly in the dark. Michael stumbled to a stop, his chest heaving with exertion. He had nowhere to go. The figures surrounded him, their faces pale and gaunt, their bodies barely more than wisps of smoke and shadow. And then, From the center of the group, a single figure stepped forward, the same one he had seen in the mirror, in the fog. It spoke, its voice a harsh whisper that cut through the night. "You belong to Cedar Hollow now, just like all the others." As the figure reached out, Michael felt an overwhelming force pull him to the ground. His vision blurred, the world around him spinning out of control. The last thing he saw before the darkness took him was the face of the figure, its twisted smile, and the sound of its voice. "No one leaves Cedar Hollow." Michael's car was found weeks later by a passing traveler, parked at the edge of Cedar Hollow. His belongings were still inside, untouched, but there was no sign of him. The town remained empty, a place of whispers and shadows, forgotten by the outside world. Those who knew Michael tried to find him, but no one dared to enter Cedar Hollow. They knew, as many before them had learned, that once you enter the town, you never leave. It was a cold, misty evening in Ravensbrook, a town so small it didn't even appear on most maps. Surrounded by thick forests and winding dirt roads, the town was cut off from the rest of the world. Life in Ravensbrook was simple, quiet, and predictable until the night the stranger arrived. No one saw him come, but by morning, his dark figure stood out against the pale light of dawn. He appeared out of nowhere, walking slowly through the empty streets, dressed entirely in black from head to toe. His clothes looked worn, his hat pulled low, shadowing his face. The locals didn't know what to make of him. Strangers were a rarity in Ravensbrook, and something about this man felt wrong. He said nothing, didn't ask for directions, and showed no signs of weariness from his long journey. He simply walked straight to the old inn at the edge of town, a building that had been abandoned for years. When the innkeeper, Mrs. Talbot, heard the knock on her door, she was startled. She hadn't had a guest in over a decade. Still, she greeted the man as she would anyone, her voice shaky but polite. "Welcome," she said, standing in the doorway. "Can I help you?" The man nodded but said nothing, reaching into his coat and handing her a small pouch of coins. She hesitated, eyeing him with a mix of suspicion and curiosity. His silence was unsettling, but the weight of the coins convinced her to allow him inside. He handed her a name written on a slip of paper, Mr. Graves. That was all he left behind, a name as cold and ominous as the man himself. In the days that followed, strange things began to happen in Ravensbrook. Animals in the town's outskirts were found dead, their bodies drained of blood and left in perfect circles. The townsfolk whispered about it in hushed tones, but no one dared voice their fears aloud. Superstitions ran deep in Ravensbrook, and they knew better than to speak of dark things. The stranger was never seen during the day, but at night, flickering lights could be seen in his window at the inn. Some claimed to hear low chanting coming from his room. Others said they saw strange shadows moving across the walls, though the man never left the building. No one dared approach him. But Matthew Carter, the town's youngest and most curious resident, couldn't resist. He had heard the stories from the older folk about the stranger, the animals, the lights, and his curiosity burned brighter than his fear. One evening, he crept through the shadows and approached the inn. The door was slightly ajar, creaking in the evening breeze. He peered inside and saw Mr. Graves sitting at a small table, his back to the door. A strange book lay open in front of him, its pages filled with symbols Matthew had never seen. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, and smelled of sulfur. As Matthew leaned in closer, he felt a cold hand grip his shoulder. Startled, he turned to see Mrs. Talbot standing behind him, her face pale and her eyes wide with fear. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered, pulling him away from the door. "Go home, Matthew." Now, Matthew didn't argue. He could feel something was wrong, something far worse than he had imagined. That night, the dreams began. The townspeople, every man, woman, and child, experienced the same terrifying vision. They saw the town consumed by darkness, the trees in the forest twisted and alive, reaching out to pull them in. And at the center of it all stood Mr. Graves, his face still hidden beneath the shadow of his hat, watching as the town descended into chaos. When they awoke, the air felt heavier, like something sinister had settled over Ravensbrook. Panic began to spread. The older residents, who remembered the old legends, warned that something unnatural had come to the town. It was Father O'Malley, the town's priest, who first spoke up. "This man is no ordinary traveler," he said during a gathering at the church. "He carries with him an ancient darkness. We must cast him out before it's too late." But fear had already paralyzed the town. No one dared confront Mr. Graves, not after the nightmares, not after the dead animals. They could feel it, something terrible was coming. A week after the stranger's arrival, Mrs. Talbot disappeared. She was last seen leaving the inn late at night, her face pale and her hands trembling. By morning, her house was empty. The townspeople searched the surrounding woods, but there was no sign of her. It was as if she had vanished into thin air. Rumors spread quickly. Some said she had seen something in Mr. Graves' room that had driven her mad. Others believed she had been taken by whatever dark force followed him. Matthew, unable to shake his curiosity, approached the inn once more. This time, he was determined to see what was inside Mr. Graves' room. As he reached the door, he noticed the strange symbols etched into the wood. They weren't there before. The door creaked open, revealing a room that looked completely different from the one he had seen just days ago. The walls were covered in more symbols, and the air felt colder than before, like the chill of death itself. At the center of the room was a large, black mirror. Its surface shimmered with an unnatural light, reflecting nothing but darkness. Matthew stepped closer, his breath catching in his throat. The mirror seemed to pulse, as if something was trapped within it, something waiting to be released. Just as he reached out, a voice echoed from behind him. "Curiosity can be dangerous, boy." Matthew spun around to see Mr. Graves standing in the doorway, his face still obscured by the shadow of his hat. His voice was soft, but it carried an undeniable threat. Matthew backed away, fear gripping him. The room felt alive, the walls seemed to close in on him. Without another word, he bolted from the inn and didn't stop running until he reached the safety of his home. That night, another resident disappeared. As the disappearances mounted, the townspeople grew desperate. They begged Father O'Malley to perform an exorcism, to drive whatever evil had come to Ravensbrook back into the shadows. But it was too late. The darkness had already taken root. Every night, the dreams grew worse. They saw visions of Ravensbrook consumed by flames, the trees burning as the sky turned black. And always, at the center, was Mr. Graves, standing in the ashes, watching them with eyes they could never fully see. The townsfolk tried to flee, but the roads out of Ravensbrook twisted and turned, leading them back to the town. It was as if the land itself had become cursed, trapping them in a nightmare from which there was no escape. As Ravensbrook descended into chaos, the townsfolk began to gather at the church. It was their last sanctuary, a place they believed could protect them from whatever dark power Mr. Graves wielded. Father O'Malley, now a man haunted by fear but strengthened by faith, took charge of the situation. "We cannot wait any longer," he declared to the terrified crowd. "Whatever that man is, he has brought something unnatural into our town. We must confront him tonight." The townspeople, though shaken, nodded in agreement. They could feel the evil tightening its grip on their lives. With each passing day, the air grew heavier and the disappearances more frequent. It was clear, if they didn't act soon, there would be no one left. That evening, a group of brave souls, Father O'Malley, Matthew, and a few others, gathered outside the inn. Armed with torches, pitchforks, and holy symbols, they prepared for what lay ahead. No one spoke, but the tension in the air was palpable. The door to the inn swung open with an eerie creak, as if it had been expecting them. Inside, the flickering candlelight barely illuminated the dark, cold room. Mr. Graves stood in the center, facing the black mirror, his back to the group. His presence was suffocating, as if the very darkness in the room was drawn to him. Father O'Malley raised a crucifix, his voice trembling but resolute. "In the name of God, I command you to leave this town." For the first time since his arrival, Mr. Graves spoke, his voice as cold and hollow as the grave. "You cannot command what you do not understand, Father. This town has been mine long before you, long before any of you." The candles flickered violently, and the shadows on the walls began to twist and contort. The air grew colder, and the oppressive atmosphere weighed down on everyone in the room. Matthew, standing at the back of the group, felt a sharp chill run down his spine. His eyes were drawn to the black mirror, now glowing with an unnatural, otherworldly light. It was as if something was staring back at him from within the glass, something ancient and malevolent. "Father, look at the mirror," Matthew whispered, but his voice was barely audible above the rising wind that now howled through the inn. Father O'Malley turned his gaze toward the mirror, his face paling as he realized the true source of the evil. It wasn't just Mr. Graves. The mirror was a gateway, a portal to something far darker than any of them had imagined. Before anyone could react, the black mirror began to pulse violently, the light within growing brighter and more sinister. The ground trembled beneath their feet, and a low, guttural sound filled the room, like the growl of something awakening from deep below the earth. Matthew's heart raced as he stepped backward, his eyes locked on the mirror. Through the shimmering surface, he could see shadows moving, figures that didn't belong in this world. Something was trying to break through. "Stop him, Father!" Matthew shouted, his voice breaking the tension. Father O'Malley rushed forward, his crucifix held high, but as he neared Mr. Graves, a force knocked him back with such strength that he crashed into the wall. The room erupted in chaos. The wind howled louder, knocking over furniture, and the flames of their torches flickered wildly, struggling to stay lit. Mr. Graves turned slowly to face them, and for the first time, they saw his eyes, cold, black voids that seemed to devour the light. "You cannot stop what has already begun," he whispered, a twisted smile creeping across his face. Suddenly, the mirror shattered, and from its broken shards, black tendrils of smoke began to pour out, filling the room with a choking darkness. The tendrils writhed like living creatures, slithering across the floor, reaching out toward the terrified townsfolk. As the black tendrils spread, Matthew felt one wrap around his ankle, its icy grip pulling him toward the center of the room. He struggled, kicking at it, but it was too strong. The others tried to help, but the darkness was everywhere now, filling the room with a suffocating force. Father O'Malley, weakened from the impact, struggled to stand. He watched in horror as Mr. Graves raised his arms, his voice rising in a chant that echoed through the walls, a language none of them understood. The black tendrils, now fully unleashed, began to twist and weave around the room, enveloping everything they touched. The screams of the townspeople filled the air as one by one, they were pulled into the darkness. Matthew fought with all his strength, but the tendrils were relentless, dragging him closer to Mr. Graves, closer to the source of the evil. Just as he felt the darkness closing in, Father O'Malley, with the last of his strength, shouted a prayer, his voice filled with desperation. "In the name of the Almighty, I cast you out." The room shuddered, the tendrils momentarily recoiling from the force of the prayer. For a brief moment, it seemed like Father O'Malley's words had power over the darkness. But Mr. Graves simply laughed, a hollow, mocking sound that sent chills down their spines. "You're too late, Father," he said, his voice dripping with malice. "This town belongs to the shadows now." And with that, the tendrils surged forward again, wrapping around Father O'Malley, silencing him forever. Matthew watched in horror as the priest disappeared into the black mass. The darkness was all around him now, cold and suffocating. He couldn't breathe, couldn't think. His vision blurred as the tendrils closed in, pulling him into the abyss. But just as the darkness began to swallow him, something within Matthew stirred, a spark of defiance, a refusal to succumb to the evil that had taken his town. With a final burst of strength, he reached for the crucifix that had fallen from Father O'Malley's hand. Gripping it tightly, he raised it above his head, his voice trembling but filled with determination. "I will not let you take me." The crucifix glowed faintly in the dark, and for a brief moment, the tendrils recoiled, as if the light was too much for them to bear. Matthew felt the grip on his body loosen, the tendrils pulling away, retreating toward the shattered mirror. But Mr. Graves wasn't finished. His eyes burned with hatred as he stepped forward, the black voids within them swirling with darkness. "You cannot escape your fate, boy." As he reached out toward Matthew, a deafening roar filled the room. The tendrils, now writhing in agony, surged back toward the mirror, as if being pulled by an unseen force. The air grew thick with the sound of breaking glass and the low, guttural growl of something far below the surface of the earth. And then, in an instant, it was over. The tendrils vanished, the mirror shattered completely, and Mr. Graves was gone. Matthew stood alone in the inn, the crucifix still clutched in his trembling hand. The room was silent, the darkness lifted, but Ravensbrook would never be the same. Epilogue, the aftermath. Days passed, and the town of Ravensbrook slowly began to rebuild, though it was a shadow of its former self. Those who survived spoke little of the events that had transpired, too afraid of what might return if they dared speak of it. Matthew left Ravensbrook soon after, unable to bear the weight of the memories. He knew the darkness was gone, for now, but he also knew that somewhere out there, in the shadows of forgotten places, evil was waiting, watching, biding its time. And he would never forget the cold, empty eyes of the stranger in black.